and welcome to the Ark Files, a seminar that is going to be all about the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if you don't know much about this item or its history, you can still follow because I'm going to try and make it simple, and I'm also going to share some basic knowledge. And if you're one of those who already know a lot, I'm sure I'll be able to shed some new light on the topic for you. So even if this is the first time you hear of it, or if you know a lot, I'm hoping this seminar will benefit you regardless of your background. Now, I've written two books on the topic of the Ark, and one has been translated into English. And at the end of the seminar, I'm going to give you a web address where you can download one of these books for free. Now, I don't like to speculate too much, and I'm a great fan of looking at just the facts. However, I do think that this book contains facts, and therefore it's going to be our guideline throughout the series. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is the most holy object described in the Bible, and it once stood in the Jewish temple. Then it was lost. There has been many theories on what happened to it, but the Bible itself doesn't say what happened. Some think that it had supernatural powers. Others, they don't even believe it ever existed. In our days, the Ark has been portrayed in at least one fantasy movie, and here's a rather large replica from the carnival in Rio, and here in Jerusalem is a replica being escorted by Christians and Jews at Sukkot. There has been several claims that the Ark has been found. Some say it's in a cave in the desert. Some claim it's in a church in Ethiopia, and some claim it's right underneath the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Here you can see Jews praying in front of the famous Wailing Wall. And of course they're praying towards their Temple Mount, where their temple once stood, and where the Ark of the Covenant was. Now, the Muslim mosque is standing at the same place, or at least very close to where the Jewish temple once stood. And this is, of course, creating a lot of emotions in both Muslims and Jews. And some Jews are thrilled with the idea that the Ark would be hid right underneath the dome, indicating it to be their rightful property. Some people even wants to tear down the Muslim mosque, and others don't believe that the Jewish temple should be rebuilt until the Messiah comes. And we're going to look briefly at some of these claims. However, we're going to have our main focus on the claim made from a man from Tennessee. He started excavating in Jerusalem in 1979, and he claims he found it in 1981. His claim was shocking to many because he claimed the Ark was and is hid right underneath the Golgotha escarpment where Jesus was crucified. And he said there was an earthquake crack going from the crosshole down towards the cave, and that blood had gone from Christ's side and down onto the Ark. So we are definitely going to look into this claim. But first, we're going to go through the basics so that anyone, no matter what background, can follow this topic. The story behind why God had the Ark of the Covenant made. So, according to the Bible, in the beginning, there was a God who created the heaven and the earth, and the first human couple, Adam and Eve. And God gave them the right to rule over the planet and over all the animals. Their main home, or their base of leadership, was in a garden called Eden, where God had planted two special trees. One was the tree of life, and the other tree was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They were not allowed to eat of this particular tree. God planted this tree in the Garden of Eden as a representation of their loyalty to their Creator and Supreme King. Now, some think this was the only commandment, but there was another. After the creation, God sanctified the Sabbath and made it holy, a memorial of Him as the Creator. So Adam and Eve had to sanctify this day also, and they were not allowed to touch or eat of the fruit of this one tree. And they were happy. However, a war had started in heaven, a battle between one of God's great cherubims and God Himself. And we read in Ezekiel 28, verse 14 to 15, You were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth amidst of fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created, till iniquity was found in you. And from Isaiah, how you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nation. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation, on the furthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High. Now notice the words like the Most High. Like God, he wanted to be like God. Now there is a lot of mysticism around his name. He's not just known as Lucifer, but also the devil, the serpent, and Satan. Now in the Bible, names are sometimes used to reveal someone's character or someone's function. The word Satan simply means the opponent. He wanted to exalt his throne. He did no longer wish to follow God's leadership, and he convinced 1/3 of God's angels to follow him instead. On earth, he came in the form of a serpent, and he tempted Eve to eat of the forbidden tree. So, you could say that Eve's sin had some similarity with the cherubim's sin, and that's why it was so serious. He claimed that instead of being God's loyal child, she would become as God. But God had said that if she was disobedient to his law, she would receive a death penalty. Attempting to become as God herself, she broke one of the commandments of God, and she was registered an offender of the law and received a death sentence along with her husband, who also ate of the tree. So what we have here is God claiming through this tree that he left on the planet he created, that he owned the planet and the right to reign over it and over them. As long as they didn't eat of this tree, they agreed in God's right as a lawmaker on the earth. But they did. The couple and the leaders of their planet was now under the accusation of having broken the law of the Supreme King of the universe, and they lost privileges of caring for God's garden in Eden. But as they were horrid with the consequences of the riot, God noticed something in them that he did not notice in the cherubim who had made similar sin. And so he noticed their repentance, and a promise came from the Creator. He said that from the womb of Eve, someone would come and win victory on their behalf. They were left with the hope of a Redeemer. From that time, they were asked to sacrifice a lamb, to put the blame for their sin on this lamb, and then killing it. God gave them a promise of a substitute who would take their punishment. Thus the hope of the Messiah arose. The hope and the promise given to Eve was an inspiration to all of the world's ancient religions. Now the same has happened today. Christianity started with one man and his 12 apostles, but today we have hundreds of different denominations, all claiming to have the truth. And so it was back then. Adam and Eve received a promise and instructions, and since then many of the religions that later arose was because they all thought they had the truth of what once was given to them. But of course all of them couldn't have the exact truth. So a woman with a child that would be a hero was a part of the early religions after the flood. Egypt and the kingdoms of Mesopotamia, the great nations of the past, they all had it in their religion too. Many claimed to be this hero, but truth had become so corrupted that God needed to have a group that would represent him and the truth of him before the rest. Around this time, the Creator chooses a man, later known as Abraham, to guard the truth of him. His grandchild, Jacob, was also called Israel, and his 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. They ended in Egypt, where they were made into slaves of Pharaoh. Now we're going to go back to the cherubim that wanted to be like God. He dressed as a serpent to fool Eve, and after this God condemned the serpent to have to crawl on his belly. Now, serpents have, to our scientific knowledge, never had wings or legs. However, ancient cultures seem to know that the serpent once had it, showing how the story of what happened in the garden might have been something they all knew of. And you can see these images from, for instance, Egypt. Now, there might be a double condemnment here. In the Bible, the cherubims are described with wings and not the angels. Now, the cherubim's wings were a part of their work tool, or their function. The wings were used to protect God and what is holy, and they used them to humble themselves before God. Now, if a cherubim would have his wings taken away from him, it meant that it lost its job and function. So God may have let us know here that the betrayer also lost his job as a cherubim, and the instrument he used, the serpent, partook in his punishment. And we're going to talk more about cherubims when we go into the details of the Ark of the Covenant. As you've seen on the pictures, it has 2 cherubims. But again, instead of protecting God's tree like a cherubim should have done, he did the opposite. Instead of defending God and his law, he did the opposite. Now notice on some of the images from the early religions from Mesopotamia, where you also see cherubim standing on each side of a holy tree. Now it's interesting because you can see that not only the Bible but also the ancient religions had elements of the same stories in them. So, back to Israel. Now God leads them out of captivity in Egypt towards Canaan, a land he had promised Abraham. But first God wanted them to come to Mount Sinai, where he would make a special covenant with them. They were to represent him to the world. So God met with them there, and through his servant Moses, he asked them to build him a sanctuary so he could dwell amidst them. And this is how the sanctuary looked. And Moses was told to build this after a pattern that another author in the Bible, Paul, says was of the heavenly things. So this sanctuary was a copy of a sanctuary in heaven, very important. Now it had 7 main items, and 2 of these items combined were the Ark of the Covenant, and it was to stand in the place called the most holy place of the tabernacle. God wrote with his own finger his 10 commandment law on 2 tables of stone, and these tables were called the 10 words and God's testimony. Now I want you to remember this as we continue the study, God's testimony. These tables of stone were to be placed into the ark, and so this is the basic, and in the next episode we're going to get down to business and talk about the ark's significance. What is the ark and what is the purpose of it? Why did God ask to have it made? To learn more about Adam and Eve and the Israelites and the ark, you can please study the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus for a more complete picture. And these 2 books are the first 2 books in the Bible. Now in the next sequence we're going to talk about what the ark is, and the ark is several things, and we're going to start off with focusing on one, especially one of the things, and I think this will amaze many. Thank you for listening.